And so we're going to move right now into the strategic planning and academic and system oversight committee. Governor Martin is going to lead the way here.
Okay, so to move right quickly into the committee. First item is called in order, and I'll have the approval of minutes. Can I get a motion?
Second.
Okay, so we move the second, we approve the minutes. Everybody in favor? Aye. Opposed? Okay. Now I'm going to go into the committee work plans. This was on the agenda at the last meeting, and we didn't have time to go through all the work programs. So we want to ask each of our team leads to go through the individual work programs and try to move this as quickly as possible. But we do feel that we need to make sure we have the adequate amount of time so that everyone knows what the work plans are. So we're going to start with the first group, Focus Mission, Strategic Planning, and University Compacts. Governor Pappas.
Thank you, Governor Martin. Is this on? The chart that appears in your red folder that looks like this represents the best that we've been able to come up with as a concise description of the direction that the Strategic Planning Committee will be heading over the next months. And the work, of course, that Governor Dasburg undertook in great detail in defining the strategic plan for the university system was a first-generation project for this Board of Governors. The work that we've defined to be done is the result of changing circumstances, changing environments, changing priorities for the state. So we now are moving into what will be a second generation of that effort. In addition to the focus on the goals and objectives and targets for the state from an economic development standpoint, we also are now going to drill down into the way in which the institutions themselves play into that structure. So instead of stating these goals as broad-based goals for the university system, we now have to begin to focus on how do the universities, each as an important part of that objective, play a role. We have been dancing around with this issue way too long, and we have not gotten where we need to be. The fact is that there are now all kinds of reasons why that priority is heightened. The economic climate in the nation and the state of Florida is dramatically different, and in my view is going to stay in a rather depressed condition for a while. So the issue about how we're going to fund and how we're going to build excellence, as we talked about this morning, is even more challenging than we faced in the prior years in which we addressed this issue. And there aren't going to be any magic bullets. So alignment of institutional missions and focusing on how we do that in the most effective manner is no longer a luxury. It is an absolute necessity. The second component of it is we are now looking at an externality of the state college system. And if we don't align ourselves, we're going to be aligned by the legislature, by other institutions, by other external factors. So we need to get about this business, and we need to get it done, and we need to get it done quickly. So the next 6 months need to be an absolutely targeted effort on figuring out what role each institution plays in delivering the products that the governor addressed this morning in achieving excellence and working those parts together in a manageable fashion. It is not going to be easy. We're not all going to agree. I suspect there'll be a lot of tense moments and tense conversation. But the first thing that has to happen is we need to get from the institutions themselves a clear understanding of what your thinking is, what your mission is, what your vision is. We then roll that up into an overall strategic plan that we can say to the legislature, to the state of Florida, to the citizens, this is what the university system for Florida is supposed to look like in 2025. We pick our time. And we show how each institution plays into that picture. And then we go about defining what is the funding requirement that it's going to take to achieve this vision. And we show them the dollars. And we, for once, show them a complete package of this is what you're buying in a university system, and this is the price tag. And if you don't want this, or you're not willing to pay for it, or you're only willing to pay so much, then we can only get it so far. But that kind of overall, overarching vision of how the dollars relate to the end product, in my view, is a missing link that we will not achieve the appropriate and predictable funding conversation in a meaningful fashion until we have put a very definitive picture on the table of what the system looks like and how much it costs and why. It moves us out of the issue of enrollment funding as the only way in which we address dollars, which is counterproductive, it seems to me, to deal with the quality issue. So each one of the pieces that are on this piece of paper are segments that deal with the issue of what alignment is about. And it is likely a situation in which the focus, mission, strategic planning, and university compacts, which is the top part of this, will become the roll-up for the other components, and then will roll into appropriate and predictable funding. So that's the big picture from my standpoint. Right now, it's only my big picture, so I don't know even if the rest of the Board of Governors agree with it, but that is what, from my vantage point right now, I see strategic planning moving into, and I'm happy if any of the members would like to discuss it, and we also will take a few minutes for each one of the team leaders to talk about the work that they're planning to do.
Governor Pepps, I think the one thing that I heard from the conversation is that you talked about 6 months. You would like to have this wrapped up in 6 months. Is that correct?
Yes.
So we will have a time certain, we'll lay out a specific schedule. That means that both universities and staff will have to work cooperatively together to accomplish this very aggressive goal. I know that Governor Dashberg has spent a lot of time in the forward design, and we've been discussing this for at least a year and a half or 2 years. So now it's time to bring everything to closure, and it's time to roll up our sleeves and get busy.
And let me be clear, because I think my perception of this is that the 6-month effort will be focused on getting this alignment discussion squared away, which would then roll into the appropriate and predictable funding conversation. So I don't, and also finalizing the Board of Governors strategic plan. So I think it's too aggressive to assume we're going to have all that done in 6 months, but the alignment piece has got to be done. It's absolutely got to be done. So by June of next year, we better be ready to button it up. And it's a heavy workload, but it's, you know, the time's here.
Okay, very good. Any questions?
The question I have, Lynn, is how far along is staff on the compact? You know, I've noticed that I was appointed with Sheila and yourself. I haven't had any contact at all by any staff. I finally got from the chancellor the compact agreement when he visited with me, but that's a good are we
question.
ready to move on that?
And I should have covered that in my remarks on the efforts that I've been undertaking. One of the issues we ran into with the compacts is the compacts were originally developed as an issue associated with funding, and this is before the bottom fell out, frankly. So the idea of the compacts was to help to give us some focus on each institution's need for funding, and it was as much a focus to direct a funding conversation as it was to, in fact, more so than to address an alignment conversation. It's my view that the alignment, we got the cart before the horse. We can't be talking about funding with respect to each institution until we talk about the alignment discussion. So I think the alignment has to become the priority. The compact form became its own bone of contention because there was issues about how the information was delivered. Was it make work, because, you know, they all have their own strategic plans. So I think, from talking to a couple of the provosts, I think the direction we should go in on the compacts is meet with the provosts and gain the information, which staff will be able to do, about their institutional mission and goals and plan with the existing materials that they have. I mean, if they're not mature enough or developed enough, then we may have to help them along in pulling out the data and the information. But let's not reinvent the wheel of what their, you know, their place in the universe is, because we want it in a different format. So that is a fact-gathering exercise that will be going on with our staff and the provost. At the same time, I've asked the staff to bring to the board a succinct articulation of what do other structures in the nation look like. So we can begin to see, that would work for us, that wouldn't work for us, maybe we take two pieces and put them together, but there's no sense in us doing this from absolute whole cloth. We should take advantage of what systems are out there that we think have done a good job and that we would emulate, that might fit our model, and then that will be going on at the same time as this compact discussion is going on, and that will be what begins to shape the alignment methodology. Then we'll take the data that came from the institutions and start figuring out how to put those pieces together. I think it's going to take at least a couple workshop kind of days. This isn't going to happen at this kind of meeting, but that's just my view. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, Tony Dexter.
Yes. We have been struggling for a number of years with item A on this list. I end each Board of Governors meeting with the equivalent of Cato's, thus we should burn Carthage. Mine is, thus we should emulate the California system. But if we cannot develop a consensus around A, you can't get to B and C under the first heading, which is focus missions, etc. So I would suggest, whether it's 6 months or whatever the time is, you're the chair of the committee, I would suggest that we roll up our sleeves and try to develop a consensus around item A here. In the current strategic plan, which goes back to the end of the first year after this board came into existence, we really left an opening that says explicitly in that document that we will visit the structure at a later date, because we had to get a strategic plan in, and we developed and spent a lot of time on goals and production and metric, but we recognized that we did not have a consensus built around a structure. And I would just encourage our chair and others that we need to get the energy behind A. If we're going to have the California system or the Texas system or the North Carolina system or our own system, until we resolve this and we say this is how many universities we're going to have and this is how we're going to produce baccalaureates in a state system, and until we go back and take the best out of the Pappas report, you can't really come to a conclusion on item B and C, which of course are critical before you do anything else on the chart.
I completely agree, and I have asked the staff to begin the process of collecting the information for just that discussion, and I believe that probably the opening salvo will be a workshop session for the board of the whole to address just that, and have a learning session about other systems and how they're structured.
And by the way, maybe we can have the Pappas people come back to kind of help moderate that session, because they studied all of this, all of the systems that seemed even remotely useful to the state of Florida, and so we could build on what we've already invested in terms of time and effort.
Okay, any other questions for Governor Pappas? Moving on to the next item, go ahead.
Ava was going to...
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Governor Parker is now going to talk about baccalaureate degrees and system structure.
Thank you very much, Governor Martin. I just want to take a minute to go over our plans as it relates to the baccalaureate degrees and system structure. You know, I certainly echo the kudos that we've given Governor Dashford for the lead that he's taken in this area and his support for Forward by Design. I think if you look at the document that Governor Pappas referred you to with the kind of cheat sheet with the yellow and blue lines, you see that under baccalaureate degrees and system structure, under A, it kind of gives you the goals that we have, I guess, as a subcommittee. And that is, we're going to define the role of the state university system as it relates to professional, doctoral, master's, and baccalaureate degree production and other public and private university post-secondary institutions in Florida. This becomes an issue because, our system and layout has certainly changed a lot since our adoption of Forward by Design. So it's going to be important for us first to determine, what role should we play in the production of our baccalaureate degrees, and then secondly is to go in and determine the role of distant learning, collaborative relationships, service or trade areas, and branch campuses and other educational sites. Now, in reaching those goals, we actually have developed our subcommittee into different groups. We have the Commissioner Smith is going to take the lead on readiness initiatives. Governor Solano is going to take the lead on distance learning initiatives, and Governor Dashberg is going to take the lead on system structure. There are three major activities that I want to bring to your attention that will have some impact on how we go about reaching our goals. The one is that the Florida College System Task Force that is in place, that Commissioner Smith is chairing, and that's certainly, and President Genshav is a member of that task force as well. The direction that task force takes will certainly have some impact on what role we feel we should play in the production of baccalaureate degrees. That task force is planning to have its last meeting in December and to release this report in January. So we're actually, our staff is participating in that process. Dr. Genshav is definitely there, kind of making sure that the SUS interests are protected along with Commissioner Smith. So what happens with that will have some impact on what we do. The second group is the Florida Distance Learning Task Force. Fortunately, President Hitt is co-chairing that task force, and Richard Stevens, who's a member of our staff, is also a member of that task force. Governor Solano has been monitoring its activities for our project team, and we're hoping that although the legislature had given them until March to come back with a report, we're anticipating that report may be released in January. And I see Dr. Hitt shaking his head. That'd be good for us as well in reaching a 6-month goal that's been established by our chair. And then third, the third major activity is the myriad of activities related around readiness, access, and success. Some of these are actually having been led on a national level, and the commissioner and our staff are involved in the process, and we'll be looking for the commissioner for an update on this. So I give you that as a backdrop, and here are basically the items that we plan to cover. Certainly they've been included in your packets, but it may be of some assistance if I give you just the bigger overview. But by the month of March, it is our goal that we're going to adopt a set of principles regarding the role of the SUS in degree production. By March, we're going to adopt a set of principles regarding the role of the SUS in degree production. We're going to discuss existing types of collaborative relationships for degree production, their effectiveness, and their potential for meeting state needs. Our third goal is to determine if service or trade areas should be designated for state universities. Fourth, we're going to review information related to branch campuses and other educational sites and give staff direction regarding drafting regulations for establishing sites off the main campus. And then finally, approve recommendations regarding distance learning. There are just two more issues that I need to mention for our work plan. One is the approval of several regulations that need to be updated, such as the transfer of credit and acceleration mechanisms regulations and several others, as well as toward the end of 2009, we'll need to determine if we should develop a process for independently functioning branch campus to follow if they want to become freestanding universities. So our plan is that our subcommittees will have several meetings between now and March. So by the month of March, we'll have hopefully met our goals regarding the 5 items that I previously discussed, and have them available for the full board to discuss. And that's our proposed plan, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Or is it Mr. Chair? I'm sorry.
We're not quite sure. Go ahead. Okay, any questions for Governor Parker? We now move to the next item. We have Governor Tico Perez, appropriate and predictable funding.
Thank you, Governor Martin. As you can see, our work plan lays out several milestones for development of a funding model that, as Governor Pappas said earlier, is going to be a departure from our current funding approach. The idea is going to be to build the LBR through the next several years around cost increases and quality improvement instead of just enrollment numbers. not just the number of students, but quality improvements and cost increases. Kind of novel. We anticipate completion of that work in the next year, and we will start with the 2010 budgeting process. The funding model working group is working very hard. We have representatives from all 11 universities. Several of the provosts are actively involved, and they actually met again yesterday. They've developed a detailed outline of a funding model and are working through some of the various pieces, parts, to make certain we can get some agreement. Obviously, there is a balance of equities involved in the process, and it's going to take a little bit of time as they work as a working group. The plan is for the group to report their progress, hopefully their success, but at least their progress at our March board meeting, and then we'll be able to move forward from there.
Thank you. Any questions for Governor Perez? If not, we'll move on now to the next two items. And we have Governor Kellen Roberts, Economic Development, Workforce, and Research, and also Health and Medical Education. Governor Roberts.
Thank you, Chair Martin. We all recognize that the potential of our universities to transform Florida's economies as engines of economic development is clearly understood and more important than ever. Innovation is one of our most valued products, and a product distinct from those provided from other educational sectors. Securing appropriate funding for our existing and new medical schools will provide tremendous economic boosts, while at the same time addressing one of Florida's and our nation's most critical need, the provision for adequate health care. Our big picture goals, we have 4 big picture goals. Number 1, to demonstrate that we are aligning our efforts with regard to workforce and providing the right skill sets for our graduates to compete in a global economy. To better tell the story of the state university system's accomplishments in research and economic development so that we can simply be entrusted with more funding. To work toward an optimal relationship with business and industry, and ensure that our new medical schools are accredited and all our medical schools are appropriately funded. Thank you. Mr. and Mrs. Chairs.
Okay, any questions for Governor Roberts? The next area we'd like to discuss is the academic programs, and the academic program subcommittee with Governors Temple and Marshall had one meeting. And again, if you look at the sheet was passed out with the yellow and blue lines in terms of academic programs, again, we'll be focusing on drilling down within the academic programs, and the primary component of our work plan will be to look at the reviewed and approval or termination of the programs based upon the DOT regulations that were revised last spring. And as you recall, so a lot of activity has been in this particular area. The work plan includes the responsibility to review the Board of Government regulations relating to the academic affairs that will also revise and update it. So this will be an ongoing process. We've asked staff to begin to take a look at these areas and come back to the review team and make recommendations to us that will be coming back to the full committee and then to the full board. This is, I think, been a long time in coming in terms of the process that was laid out, and I'm very encouraged to see how well we have put together these work plans in a relatively short order. But again, that way everyone knows exactly what we're doing, and we're going to be establishing some time frames in order to move some of these things forward. Okay? Any questions? Next, we have Governor Pappas to talk about the university system strategic alignment accountability issues. Governor Pappas.
Actually, I think Governor Roberts is going to talk to us about the areas of strategic emphasis, because we have been considering changes in that as we move towards the strategic plan. So,
If you allow me, I'm going to have Dr. Ari Lamont come in on that, please. It's a bad sign when he has that big book.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members, you've all been briefed on this item. It's the second time that you have seen it, and but just very quickly to remind you, in the context of Forward by Design, you asked staff to go back to your original strategic plan and to revisit the identified programs of strategic emphasis in the plan. We have done that. We've gone back. We've made some recommended changes to you. Others have stayed largely the same, and still others have been clarified more. As an example, in the area of teacher preparation, continues to be, we think, an area of strategic emphasis, but we would point out specific areas of critical need as identified by the Commissioner and the Department of Education. Primarily, the issue around this, and I must say in closing that we received support from externally from the Council of 100, Enterprise Florida, Workforce Florida, and generally speaking, consonance from the universities also as the identification of these areas, provided that they were identified as areas, if you will, and tools for the upcoming conversations with regard to university compacts, but that they were areas that were not front-end loaded with specific degree programs to form one single state of Florida list of degree programs of emphasis, but rather that the areas would be identified into which the universities may drop and negotiate new degree programs, existing programs, programs to emphasize, and so on, and that this would be yet one more tool for the institutions and the Board of Governors and the Board of Trustees to have a good three-way conversation in terms of the future, the short-term future in university compacts. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
May I? When we spoke, Dr. Lamont, about the classification for economic development and regional workforce demand, I'm not quite sure what the adoption document looks like, but I expressed a concern about deleting the emphasis on high wage, and there were a number of rational justifications in here why that was done, but I feel very strongly that a big part of the problem we face in our state is that we simply are not improving wages at a pace that allows us to keep up with the cost of living, period. And so, to me, anything that de-emphasizes high wage as an important priority, even though justified, causes me concern. So I would like not to lose that as even in the title. And I don't know. Like I said, I'm not sure. This is far more than the categories of the program, so maybe my comments are out of order. I'm not sure.
I think we could work it back into this language with no problem. It was certainly no intention to lose the notion of high wage. We understand that that's one of the fundamental transformations of the economy that we would like to see.
Would you please make that change?
Yes.
Thank you.
At this point, we would like to ask for a motion for the approval of the revised areas of programmatic strategic emphasis as identified in the 2003-2013 USF strategic plan. Can you get a motion?
So moved.
It's been moved. Second?
Second.
Moved in second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, motion carries. Now, Governor Pappas will talk about the enrollment plans.
We touched on this briefly at our last meeting, and there was a brief discussion about the issue of the enrollment cap and what should be done about it at this point in time. We left that meeting without having making a final decision. Obviously, it was an outgrowth of the enrollment freeze that was put in place last year, and some questions have been raised by some universities specifically about their immediate needs to address that, a lifting of that cap. There were conflicting opinions among the board members, so we're back to revisit it today and to make a decision. Chancellor Rosenberg has some input for us that was raised by us at the meeting, wanting to understand how the universities were positioned on this issue, since it's highly unlikely that we will see any funding money to improve the enrollment situation. Chancellor?
Yes, we've spoken with all 11 universities about the impact of the limitation and how their enrollment plans would change if it were not in place, and their opinions about the criteria for exceptions to the policy. So let me briefly summarize what we've learned. Most would not grow, or they would stay within the funded plan with or without a limitation on freshman enrollment growth. A number of institutions did express the desire to expand access at the freshman level, but they did point to the budget constraints, as Governor Pappas has just pointed out. There were comments about the criteria for making exceptions, were we to make some exceptions. First was the suggestion, do not make any exceptions. The second was, consider cases where there is a capacity, where there's the ability to fund growth with marginal tuition dollars alone, with the understanding that no request will be made later to fund over-enrollment. Another suggestion, consider other factors such as population served or demand in the region, and then finally, delegate the decision to the local boards. Now, I am concerned today, perhaps even more so, particularly given the commitment of our governor to excellence with the quality of funding that we have, it does not support growth. I also recognize that a number of institutions do have some legitimate concerns. In particular, we did enclose for you the letter from Florida Gulf Coast University. So I would recommend making an exception for Florida Gulf, and would review any other requests should they formally be submitted to our office. Governor Pappas.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to put the motion on the table that we preserve the cap that we put in place last year, with the opportunity for exceptions to be dealt with by the Chancellor's office in their review with the universities of their individual circumstances, and that these exceptions acknowledge the fact that those those addition of students would not be funded or would not be the subject of requests for additional funding if they should be submitted to the Chancellor's office. I'm making that motion for, if there's a second, so that we can open this for discussion. Thank you. Are there comments from the board?
The question I would have is, as it relates to this whole concept of an exception, what criteria are we looking to establish if we're going to set the cap and then we're going to have this exception? And I think that the intent is that that's something that the decision the Chancellor would make. What criteria is it that you'd be using to determine whether or not a particular university has a factual situation that supports an exception?
Well, I think it's articulating, my intent would be that it's, in the motion may need an amendment, but as reflected in D, which is cases where there is capacity, the ability to fund growth with marginal tuition dollars, and the understanding that no request will be made to fund over enrollment. I share your concern, Ava. I raised the same thing, which is how would we define the criteria so that we're not simply faced with arbitrary circumstances. To me, I think it falls into the case of compelling, and that we would have to rely on the Chancellor to be able to evaluate that to his satisfaction. If, as a board, we're not comfortable with that condition, we certainly can bring it back to the board. The goal was to have some efficiencies in the process if necessary, but it isn't going to be something that we're going to do on a litmus test basis, I don't think. Governor Gaston?
Yes, I oppose the cap originally and consistently. And so therefore, I welcome any exemptions, even if they're capricious. But I'd just like to say that I believe the universities should make this decision, and that this board has no business becoming involved in all of this. And I think this little snippet of a discussion here demonstrates that we're going to find ourselves wondering what the criteria is, and if the criteria was imposed uniformly or even-handedly. And I think we ought to lift the cap and trust our universities to make the decisions on their own and not overly govern them on this matter. That's my speech.
Yes. Governor Tripp, and then
I'll go after Tito.
I was going to say, Governor Dasper made my speech. I concur. I mean, I think we've had our tendencies at universities self-impose caps when they felt the need was there. We have other universities who feel they've got capacity and that incremental revenue is helpful and useful. And I think we need to trust our boards of trustees to make those decisions.
I concur. As you know, I sat 8 years on the FAU board. We had numerous discussions. Presidents have to bring a budget. We have to figure out how to go forward. We're always talking about the fact that each university needs to operate itself. And the one most important thing that they do is they decide how many students that they can deal with. And I don't think we should have an overreaching role given the changes that are happening right now in the funding. We just came from a situation today. If the governor's proposal goes through, universities will have the ability to change tuition funding. We're going to try to go forward with some changes in base funding over the years, and we're looking to the universities to come to us with compacts about how they'll operate, what their needs are, what type of growth they see that they want. So I think we ought to back out of this and not have that be also a political issue going forward with the legislature this year, and let each university go to the legislature and talk to them about their needs for funding as they see it.
Other comments?
I have one.
Yeah.
Let me just say that I was just informed that the people in the back of the room are having a very hard time hearing, so please use your microphones. I guess as being fairly new to the board, I would have more of a question than a comment. It seems to me that the board took made a fairly bold statement on behalf of preserving the excellence of the system when they initially established this policy, and they did so at a time when the economy was beginning to turn south, and said, in order to preserve the excellence and the quality of our system, we just have to do this. Nothing has changed in the status of our economy. If anything, it's gone further south. So I'm having difficulty understanding why we would all of a sudden turn around and back away from a policy that we just set not too long ago. And not that I distrust the trustees or anything like that. It's not an issue of that. I just saw this as sort of a system-wide statement, and that we would all kind of hang together to try to preserve our quality, and we couldn't do that if we essentially had an open-door policy. So help me to better understand why we should reverse course when nothing has changed in our circumstances. If anything, they've gotten worse.
Could I answer just one quick question?
Governor Martin.
It's not an open-door policy, and I think you missed the point. What I am saying, and I think what Governor Dasberg is saying, is the boards of trustees are effective today. They're on the ground. They understand what their universities can do, and we should rely on them through all of the other things to make these hard decisions. If we're giving them tuition and other things, they've got to also understand how many students they want to bring in the door. Community colleges have open funding.
Governor Martin and then Governor Roberts.
I think sometimes that we can all make a decision on certain issues, and then after discussion, decide to change. I mean, at the press conference earlier today, the governor, in his comments, mentioned that he changed his opinion on higher ed, and so based on the programs he presented to us, citizens of the state of Florida. So I think we can also, after discussing issues, also make a change if we feel that it is warranted. I concur with the comments from Governors Dashford, Perez, and Tripp. I think when we look at what we're asking our universities to do, they will be making certain decisions potentially in terms of the ability to raise tuition up to 15%. As a part of that whole discussion should be enrollment. Why should we hold them to that cap? Let them make the appropriate decisions at the local level in regards to the tuition and also in terms of enrollment.
Governor Roberts.
My concern, and I'm already here, I'm joking. My concern in this conversation is that if we have a great increase in enrollment and you have the extra tuition, and the state does not fund those students, which we've had happen historically, and so you have, again, more unfunded students, and they're trailing and going through the system, and the universities put in an extra, a request for unfunded student enrollment. And it is a concern, and it's been a concern with legislative staff over the years because we've had this trailing number of unfunded students. Now, in defense of the universities, they had this great demand, and they're trying to fill the need of the state, the students who are qualified to attend their universities. And so the legislature, we hope, will fund those students if there is space in our universities. But it's not a simple a discussion because of building a base of unfunded students in our universities. And I'm sure some of the presidents can speak to it more eloquently than I can. But I had more than 1 year, have had that explained to me by legislators and legislative staff. It becomes complicated.
Yes, Governor Porter.
I guess what I can say to you historically is that as a board, I think we thought that our responsibility was to ensure that we had quality within our system. And the reality is that our numbers would suggest that if we continue to have enrolled students who are not funded, that it would ultimately impact the quality. And when you ask the question of what's so different now, and let me say one other thing. Our belief was that it's difficult to try to hold the legislature to its responsibility, because we believe that it's the responsibility of the legislature to continue to fund the enrollment. So the idea was that by placing this cap, that they would see this need, they would see the need to try to find dollars within the budget to fund these students who we want to have come into the system. So that was the concept. Why would someone like myself, who was certainly in support of that, come back now and suggest that I would vote differently? Is that it is a very different economic time to me. And I have a belief that, although it's not an easy decision to make, that if we place the cap, that it sends a message that I don't think I want to send to our citizens right now about what's available. And then two, I think that if there is a way to get our students into the system and find a way to provide them with the education, be it more crowded than I would prefer, I prefer that versus them not having a place to go. So that's why a person like myself would possibly consider changing my position a year later, with the idea that I understand that times are different, and because they are so difficult and there is no more money likely in the budget, if there is a way to get them in the door, I prefer to have them in the door than to not have them have the opportunity at all. So that's a different perspective for you.
In the door, but not able to get the classes they need.
Well, I'd like to think that the staffs of the universities would ensure that they're in the door, they're going to have classes. I would not like to think that, because that's, that's where I look to the university presidents and their staff to ensure that they're going to let them in the door, they're going to have the classes available for them, because otherwise, why would they have them there? And I know you know more because you're on campus, but I'm looking to my presidents who can say, I guess Dr. Hitt's shaking his head to say, if I let them in, I'm going to have a place for them to study, or at least a class section available for them to participate in. I'm assuming that, because that's a decision I expect them to make administratively.
Governor Martin?
Yes, I'd like to make a comment, and I'd like to reflect briefly on what happened when we established these enrollment caps at many of our universities. We actually saw an increase of our student population with the enrollment cap. Now, with that and the poor economy and cutting our budgets at our universities, we saw less courses available for our students. With that, it's difficult to be able to graduate on time. So the governor's proposal sets a tuition increase, and it's going to be valuable for our students. It's going to go to advising. It's going to go to faculty and staff salaries. But it's not going to go to general operations. And an enrollment cap seems necessary still to this day, considering that the legislature has not committed any more funding and possibly will, with the economy the way it is, possibly retract some of the funds. So seeing that, I don't see how increasing student enrollment would help our students in the classroom. And you made a comment of, I'd rather have a crowded classroom than that student not be in the classroom at all. But for some, a crowded classroom is not what they need. They need a personable relationship or a relationship with the professor in a smaller classroom. And by lifting a cap and increasing enrollment, we'll not be able to provide those students with that ability.
Can I respond to that?
Yes, Governor Parker.
I guess what I'd say to you in response to that is that I'm of the belief we have 11 options for our students, and I really believe in competition, and I believe that not all 11 fit all the students in their particular needs. So I would like to think that, as students make their decisions about what university is best for them, or as families make decisions about what university is best for them, they would consider universities that may offer smaller classes if that's what's best for that particular student. So someone told me today that really for every student that wants to come to a university, there is a space available for them. It's just a question of whether or not it is the space or the university that they would have as their first choice. So that's why I think that it would make sense that, if for some reason a family wants to go to University A, University A is going to admit more students than they actually are funded and may have a more crowded classroom, that they're making a conscious decision that maybe in that first year they're going to, may deal with that difficulty at that particular university, but they don't want that. They have the option of University B or C, where they have a smaller classroom and another option of a smaller section that they may take. So I think that that's the beauty of the system, is that we have 11 choices, and the family has to make a decision about what's the best choice based upon the way that student learns. So it's just a different perspective.
Madam Chair.
Yes, Governor Givens.
I'd just like to make a brief comment here. We just had an opportunity this morning to hear some proposals from the governor that we all support, that are designed to enhance the experience and the quality of the students' educational experience. And we have an awful lot of work to do still going forward, and I think everyone recognizes that. And until we have a different way that our general revenue is funded, and we don't rely on enrollment plans as much as we do in the development of that funding, I don't see how we can make a decision like this unless we're going to use all of the money that we're just going to get to continue to operate in the same fashion that we're operating now. The idea of this enhanced tuition opportunity was to provide some enhanced services for students so that the quality of the experience and the frequency of the sections that they need and the experience in the classroom is such that they are getting a quality education. But we still have the issue of the general revenue contribution to our total funding package, and that's not going to improve this year. We know that, and it may not improve next year or the year after. And until we can get ourselves in a situation where our entire funding picture looks different, I'm not comfortable moving away from the position that we took a year ago. I mean, as a practical matter, the idea of letting trustees make decisions like this makes a lot of sense, but it makes only sense to me in the context of budgeting, because we still have to put together a budget, and until we change the way that's done, we're going to be right back in the same boat that we've been in ever since I've been on this board, and that is that there's all this trailing unfunded enrollment, and we took the position that we were not going to allow that to happen again. And in just a moment. And I'm just reminding you of what today was about and what it was about yesterday. I mean, it has nothing to do, in my opinion, with whether trustees should make the decision or we make the decision. It just happens to be the way the budget process operates right now, and part of our next steps would be to try to make that different, too, so that there's more predictability in it, and that the enrollment plans actually mean something. And so that's why, to me, a compromise was to allow for this exception route, with the understanding that they're not going to carry, unfunded enrollments for enrollment, for funding going forward.
Governor Temple.
Yeah, I think the cap served a purpose. I think it brought attention to our low tuition. I think it brought attention to the budget cuts. I think the question is being raised is this the time now to take it off? And I'm not sure about that, but there's a motion on the floor, and I call a question.
Well, I was going to say something, but I guess I won't.
Well, you made the motion, so there's a motion on the floor.
Is there a second?
Yes.
Yes, I second the motion. Yes.
The motion was to allow the chancellor to take exceptions.
Right.
The motion was to allow the chancellor to consider and decide exceptions where there is capacity, the ability to fund growth with marginal tuition dollars alone, and an understanding that no request will be made to fund over-enrollment. And there is a second? Okay.
Is this a committee vote?
It is a committee vote. This is in committee at the moment. I think the committee is everybody. So I suppose you better take a roll call.
This is on the motion on the caps and the lifting of the exceptionality.
Well, we...
Okay. Ms. Jasper.
Could you ask
Would you read it again?
Yeah, please. Use your microphone.
I'm sorry. I don't know if this is on or not.
It is.
It is, but you can talk right into it.
It's on. You have to talk.
This is a motion that we would preserve the cap on enrollment, allowing the chancellor to consider and approve exceptions in instances where there is capacity in an institution, the ability to fund growth anticipated with marginal tuition dollars alone, and an understanding that no request will be made to the legislature to fund the requested over-enrollment.
Madam Chair, that question to you. I have an issue the way the motion is framed, because I may be for the exception, but I've got to vote against it if it's tied to the fact that I don't get to vote about continuing the cap?
Well, there is...
If everybody votes they want to continue the cap,
The
then
limit-
I'd like to vote on an exception.
Let me clarify, and the Chancellor will have to clarify for me. We have an existing action in place to cap enrollment. It was not time limited. It didn't just disappear. In my understanding, it was not required to be up for reconsideration. So the cap is, our posture is the cap exists and is sustained unless we take action to eliminate it. So this motion is to create an opportunity for exceptions to the cap. It isn't a motion to continue it or, there is no need for such a motion. Is that accurate, Chancellor?
Yes, this is a cap only on freshman enrollment. It is not a cap on 2+2 transfers who receive AAs or ASs, which is very important to our system to maintain that system of articulation. So it's only the current cap.
Okay. Well, the question's been called. So is the motion properly clarified to everyone's satisfaction? Yes. Okay, well, all in favor? Aye. Okay. Governor Dasper,
I would like to make a motion that we lift the cap and leave the decision up to the universities.
Second.
I'll speak to that motion since the question was called on the last one. I concur with Governor McGivitt, and my reasoning is not because I'm a fan of the cap. I'm not. I think it's very disappointing that we find ourselves in this circumstance. However, I am a firm believer that we have made a philosophical decision about what to do with enrollment in the current situation we're in. Nothing has changed. We have made some good progress, encouraging progress with the governor's office in discussing tuition. But those tuition dollars are not going to change the universe of what we face in operations on a day-to-day basis. We are moving into an aggressive strategic planning process. I would suggest that we consider the enrollment cap issue when we get through that process at the end of next year, and that for the time being, we maintain it in effect until we begin to see and understand how the funding model looks different and gets us out of the business of trying to use students as the sole means to provide dollars to the institution simply based on the numbers that we admit. Yes. Yes, Governor Romer.
Yes, I would like to agree with Chair Pappas' comments.
Any other comments? Yes, Governor Parkman.
Timing, if we vote to lift the caps today, that would impact enrollment for when? I guess I'm a little bit confused.
Fall.
For spring.
Fall on
For fall of
Basically, spring, there are not many FDSCs who come in the spring anyway,
Right.
I would say.
Right. Summer and fall of 2009, 2010.
Yes, Chancellor.
Well, and the challenge here, members of the board, is in essence what you're saying is you are going to use any revenue that might be incremental as a consequence of the governor's initiative to underwrite the expansion of enrollment rather than to address the issues that the governor expects us to address. And so my concern about that is that it will nullify the intent on one hand. And the second is that our concern as well is to maintain seats for our eligible community colleges, AA and AS transfers. And I know one university is doing very well at that, but we know that issues are arising in other institutions. So I think it may have the negative unintended consequence of reducing access rather than maintaining it. And then thirdly, I do worry about the stagnating graduation rates and the retention rates. And I think we should listen to our student representative who is in the classroom every day, who does understand that situation, and show sensitivity to his role and the constituency that he does represent.
Thank you, Chancellor. Governor Dasper.
It doesn't follow from this motion Mark, Mr. Chancellor. It doesn't follow from this motion, Chancellor, that the universities are going to take any one course. The fact of the matter is, by lifting the cap, it then turns the matter over to the individual universities, and the universities will structure their budgets and enrollments and go on doing things that we rely on the universities to do. We don't get into running the universities as a board of governors, and I don't see any reason why we have to impose a cap, which is tantamount to telling them how to run their business. We ought to rely on the universities to structure their budgets and their enrollment plans, and they have trustees, presidents, staffs, and I think they know what they're doing. I think it's a serious mistake for us to impose ourselves on the universities in this matter, which is really an operational matter and a choice that each university should be able to make. That's my opinion.
Governor Tripp, and then I'm
Could
going to suggest
could we
we
ask
take a vote.
for any comments from the presidents or the chairs of the boards of trustees, the representative board of trustees, how they feel about the issue of being told whether or not they can enroll more students?
To that end, could I just ask a question for clarification? Because that's an excellent point that was just made and poses a question to me. I'll work under an assumption. I'm going to assume that the cap would be remaining in place purely because of the economic circumstance that we find ourselves in, the extraordinary economic circumstance that we find ourselves in as a state at this time, that being this year. And that clearly, if the cap remains, with the exception, if that's the way it, or without the exception, this issue will have to be addressed next year at exactly the same time. Do I understand the complexity of this that way?
Well,
I think that
number one, we've already heard that the cap has no time limit. It was put in place, it doesn't sunset.
It says through fall 2010 in the document sitting right in front of me.
3 years. Oh, the 3 year, yeah, it has 3 year, I'm sorry, it has 3 years.
So we're in the second
Right, second of the three.
of the 3 years. So yes, I think that President Bergen is correct.
Yeah, that's 3 years.
Is your question answered, President Bergen?
I think it is.
I know Dr. Marshall wishes to ask a question, and I'm sorry I wasn't able to see you, but let me take your question, and then we will find out if the presidents would like to address the issue. Go ahead, Governor Marshall.
John Vashburg has spoken to the question I was going to raise a moment ago. I think in a perfect world, I would be opposed to the cap for reasons he and others have given. But I think it's a problem that may recur, and when it does, I think we ought to be ready for it. In a sense, I think this 3-year proposal readies us for whatever might happen. But back to Norman's point, I'd be interested in more comments from presidents or provosts about this.
Yes, President McGee.
I'd like to take a look at this somewhat differently, Madam Chair. In my opinion, it matters not one whit what you decide here. The reason is that there is one. I surely can. I think not all of us feel that way. I think the reason is the following. I think there's only one university that has asked for an exception. I know that at our university, you decide to keep the cap, fine. You decide to get rid of the cap, it makes no difference. We will not. We cannot afford to let in any more students for the reasons that Governor Meyer indicated. So if there's going to be no impact, and I think most of I can't speak for them, but based on what I've heard him say, I think most of my colleagues, given that they haven't asked for an exception, I think their boards, they'll have some pressure. I know my board won't deal, the pressure. They'll have some pressure to increase enrollment. Our board, will keep it in. So really, what you're talking about here, in my opinion, is not a matter of substance. You're talking about a matter of optics. And I think what the board needs to ask itself is, what is the signal that you want to send? And remember, signals are like tom-toms, on the mountain. They are not always the same beat when they get to the end of the line. Will this be read as the Board of Governors now decides that it's time to open up enrollment again, notwithstanding the technicalities, and I'm a strong advocate of local boards having a great deal of control, so I'm 100% in agreement with Governor Dazzler. So it's not a question of substance, it's a question of how will this be read, and if it is read in a way that says that now we don't have as big a problem as we had, whereas we know we're going into the steep chasm. My feet aren't touching bottom yet, so I don't know where the bottom is. I would wonder whether, although in principle, I think this is the right argument, whether timing-wise you want to do this. As far as we're concerned, substantively, it'll make no difference.
Thank you, President Medic. Any other presidents, boards of trustee members wish to comment?
We went, at FAU, we went slightly over the cap this year. We did not do it with the intent to break the cap. It was simply a function of registration, admits, et cetera, and ended up slightly over the cap. And that may happen again for some of us this year. And again, it is not to project a defiance of the cap. This is not a perfect science. So this year we were marginally over the cap, but not greatly exceeded the cap. One of the things that has to be considered is, should this piece of legislation pass, I think most of us, if not all of us, hope it does, the net effect it is going to have will not be felt the first semester it's imposed. Remember, at Florida Atlantic University, with the next round of cuts, we will have, if it's the full Monty, have absorbed $30 million in reduction. That's not a non-tangible. That came with services reduced because we reduced positions, advising, counseling, reduced the number of professors that we brought in, therefore the number of sections that we offered. And I won't even talk about all the non-academic impacts that we have felt. I would suspect our university, before we talk about taking a gigantic increase, because we no doubt have capacity at Florida Atlantic University, we're 27,000, so we probably have room to grow. But before we begin to grow again, and it'll happen rather substantially, we have to begin to put back many of the things that we took away from students and faculty in these last rounds of cuts. And that's going to take us a little bit of time. So all that to say, if we're fortunate enough to have the legislation pass and we begin to feel the net effect, our first priority, I'm presuming, will be to begin to put back the basic services that our students need that they're not getting now with the 27,000 that we currently have. So I hope, and I don't think we do, I hope we're all realistic to the fact that should the legislation pass, life doesn't change dramatically in the first semester that it does. This is going to have to take some time to first get back what we've lost before we begin to grow the quality from there.
So are you for it, against?
He's agreeing with President Medina. It doesn't matter.
That was Frank, and I answered the question.
Apparently, I answered that just right.
Another Frank filibuster.
You sound like it.
If we grow the same way we did last year, which is to our projected cap, or if we were to grow slightly under it, and I hope that's not true, but if we grew slightly over it for the same reasons, we'd be perfectly satisfied. Because again, our first priority is going to be building back the things we've lost over the last several years. I only mention that overage because it's important that people understand why one might go over the cap, and it is far more than just saying we're going to ignore the cap that exists. So I think we're comfortable with where we are. Again, and I'll go back to my original statement, because of where we are in these extraordinary times today, that may change next year.
I think the issue is a philosophical one at basis to institutions that don't plan to grow under this budget scenario, which UNF is one of those. We actually shrunk. We reduced our freshman class by about a quarter and dropped about 1,100 students because we were over-enrolled for the funding we had. So there are some that have an access approach or the need to grow to be able to fund some of the non-E&G projects. The question fundamentally is, should that be left at the local level to make the decision on what to do with enrollment, Or is it a significant enough issue that the BOG feels that it needs to say, we don't want to see the education watered down with less money and more students? Obviously, there's a price that goes on there, and that's a question that reside at the BOG level, or is it something you would just go ahead and leave to the local boards? As Mitch pointed out, for many of us, we have no intention of growing until we see new dollars coming into the system.
Thank you.
Oh,
President Gibson?
I have a question before you guys. Can I interject a question in the middle of them giving their comments that maybe someone will respond to?
Yes.
If I recall, part of it, and going back to your historical question, Dr. Solano, I think part of the issue was that when we allowed so many students to come in who were unfunded, and it created an issue when universities would try to come back around and find other ways to get funding for those unfunded students. Am I remembering that correctly, or is that totally... I mean, was that part of the issue, or was that not part of it? So it created some fighting amongst universities about how they were going to pay for the students if they didn't fund?
The legislature began not to take the enrollment plan seriously because we continued to have unfunded enrollment. And we just decided we weren't going to do that anymore because, and yes, I guess some universities would make an effort to seek other methods of funding, but I don't think that was the driver.
I just wanted to, I'm sorry, thank you. For allowing me.
Thank you. President Genshaw?
Thank you. I believe that we have two very responsible bodies, and I can tell you on behalf of the University of South Florida, we're not looking to grow. Our freshman enrollment is it's not a precise science, as was mentioned before, but we're not looking to grow at that level at all. And you can't take more students in than you can serve well. And so whether it's at the Board of Trustee level, communicating what the plan is to the Board of Governors, that's fine.
Thank you.
At FAMU, we have sort of a different situation, and our goal is to grow into our funding. But I think Governor Solano has a very good point. And even with the budget cuts that we've taken at Florida A&M, our first priority is to make certain that those students who come to the university, that they have the courses that they need in order to stay on course for graduation. And I think that is extremely important. And, you know, who makes this decision about whether or not universities grow? Governor Dasberg makes a great point. We've been at this for quite some time, and we understand how important it is to have quality, and that when the students leave our institutions, that they not only compete, but they win. And I think we'll ensure that.
Thank you. President Hitt.
I would speak in favor of trusting the boards of trustees and the presidents of the institutions to make the right choices. At UCF, we were under the freshman cap a little bit this last year. We still grew 3% because we had a big influx of transfer students, and we raised our retention from freshman to sophomore year to 90%. In discussing this question just yesterday with the person who manages enrollment for us, we went over what it would take in terms of classroom seats for additional students, and we would not take more freshmen than we had classes for. That's one of our principles. So I'm not sure about whose tom-tom we use or what the optics are, but I know a little bit about managing a university, and I would like to be able to take the number of students we can take and serve responsibly, and not have to burden Mark with making an exception to a policy.
Thank you. Yes, President Dunn?
Yes, I agree with the president about letting our boards of trustees determine what it is best for the university and keeping quality. But I do have a little political concern. I think the timing of this may damage the initiative of the governor. If we lift enrollment, the perception may be, lift enrollment cap, the perception may be to the legislators, the tom-toms as they go down or up the hill, might give the perception that we are going to water down quality and we're going to flood our universities, raise enrollment greatly, to basically counter, or let's just say not respect, the spirit of the governor's initiative today. I worry about the perception being damaging our case for raising tuition. We just may be a year early with this. Once this legislation is passed, deal with that now that we can all get behind. And then next year, and I think we'll all have responsible boards of trustees, and then next year we look at, do we need to cap or not? That might be, we might need to do this in a 1-2 fashion instead of right now both of these. It might interact in a negative way for the governor's initiative today.
Thank you, President. President Brennan.
I think, just listening to the comments of my colleagues, I think it underscores how different we are. And I think it underscores probably the wisdom, if you will, of allowing the local boards to determine what our enrollment should be. Dr. Hitt, I was going to say hit on something, but maybe I shouldn't say that. Dr. Hitt touched on something. Enrollments can be very complicated. It's not just a function of who you let in, it's a function of who you retain and at what levels. And I applaud the 90% freshman and sophomore retention rate. So I want to weigh in on the side of allowing the individual institutions with their board of trustees determining what the enrollment should be. And again, we've heard, as I've listened, that we have institutions that even plan to shrink freshman enrollment. I will tell you at FGCU, the youngest state university in the system, with the youngest president, we have been given a charge to grow, and that has been reinforced with resources that we have been given. We are building buildings and classrooms. We just opened a 400-bed residence hall. We have another 400-bed residence hall opening on next fall. And let us all keep in mind, it's just not a matter of tuition. It's a matter of tuition and fees and health fees and athletic fees and everything that goes with admitting
and
students.
general revenue.
And general revenue as well. So I would strongly suggest that we relieve the chancellor of the burden of making exceptions, and we trust in the good judgment and discretion of our boards of trustees and the presidents of the institutions.
Thank you. We've heard from everybody twice. So unless somebody's got something compelling to say, I would request that we take a vote. Governor Dasper, would you repeat your motion so we're all clear?
My motion is that we lift the cap.
Okay, and there's a second?
I second.
Is the floor closed for discussion, Madam Chair?
Governor Marshall, you may make the last comment.
Well, it's a tough question, and I've wrestled with it painfully. A couple of points, though. One, it does not appear from the comments of the president that anybody has been hurt or would be hurt by this. You might not, you might need to call the chancellor, but there's apparently no real damage to your independence. Second point is that it could be reversed at any time, removed just as easily as we're imposing it now. And the third point relates to what President Judy Pence has just said. She was talking about, do we make a political statement? Well, I think we may be passing up an opportunity to make a political statement to the people of Florida. If this body says the problem of funding is so serious that we are imposing caps, does that not say something that might be useful as the people weigh this issue we've been discussing this morning, expressing their interest in providing more money to deal with a serious enrollment problem? That's the question.
Thank you, Governor Marshall.
Call the question. Madam Chair.
Call the question.
We may need a roll call vote. All in favor of the motion to lift the cap?
Are we doing it?
I'm calling for the vote. All in favor of the Nobody voted for it, John, so I'm sorry. All in favor of the motion to lift the cap, please say aye.
Aye.
All,
Was, I was persuaded.
all opposed?
No.
No. Motion fails.
Just for purposes of record, could you note those that opposed and those that voted for lifting?
We should ask our secretary, do you,
I couldn't hear.
okay, let's show hands.
I'd like to be on record.
All those who were in favor of lifting the cap, please raise your hand. Goes to Governor Perez.
Okay.
Thank you. Are we?
We're about halfway through the agenda, and now we're going to move to item number 5, and I'll make some brief comments regarding the conference call for the academic program teams, and then we'll go immediately into item 6, which is the proposal on the degree programs. On page 61 in your binder, you will find the notes for the conference call that the Academic Teams Committee held on October 31st. The team reviewed 6 doctoral programs and 1 doctoral program for termination. Prior to the conference call, team members were provided copies of each degree proposal, the staff analysis for each proposal, and additional documentation provided by the universities in advance. Okay, we're going to take a 5-minute break and reconvene about 10 till. 5-minute break. We'll reconvene.